The daily talks are essentially about happiness in daily living for the human being. And more precisely, because happiness is something very specific, the talks are about peace of mind, unbroken peace of mind in daily life. So that means daily life continues. The body continues until such time as it dies. And so the talks are about peace of mind for the human being until such time as the body dies. And so liberation doesn't bring about the end of daily life. It doesn't bring about the end of the body. We have to start asking some very practical questions in the seeking. What am I really looking for? What is really available? What are all the teachings really talking about when I read in between the lines, when I see the messages in the broader context? Because a lot of things are said, because a lot of changes have to happen. But when I really ask some practical questions, it's very important to start being practical. Because when we're not, I can assure you from personal experience, we'll get lost in theory. That we actually think is descriptions that are not theory. We can become so clear on the theory that we start to think that we see it. And seeing life through the theory in a way is seeing a deconstructed version of life, and that which is still very much here in practice, if we focus, gets overlooked. And we think that we're seeing reality. For example, theoretically, when looking at life from a very specific perspective, you can talk about the absence of time, the non-occurrence of cause and effect, or the non-existence of cause and effect. And we can come to see that in a way. So it's not, we can understand what we're being told. Cause and effect is not real. And we can come to see life where we're convinced cause and effect doesn't exist. And miss the very practical, still existence of life on another level that isn't the level being described when something like a statement like cause and effect is not real is put forward. The liberated person who might put forward the statement that says there is no cause and effect still switches on the kettle in order to get hot water. They still live their life according to rules of cause and effect. And when we are seeking, life needs to be seen differently in order to break some of the habits that underlie ignorance, the habits and the thinking patterns that perpetuate suffering. That habit needs to be broken, and so we are given a different perspective. The new perspective isn't absolute. So if we become convinced that the descriptions of life from a different perspective are absolute, what we'll find if we look closely, once we've taken on that absolute perspective, or actually it's a relative perspective that we've taken on absolutely, is we are overlooking some dynamics that are still very much present. So, when I went to see Ramesh, I had a very deep understanding, aided by a shift in the way life was perceived. The sense of self had changed experientially, and I was convinced that I knew myself as consciousness, and I was convinced that it wasn't theoretical, it was experiential. It was how I knew myself, as not the body, the formless awareness in which everything arose, of which everything is made. And that was a way of seeing life and knowing myself that had set in and was available at any moment, not as a theory, but experientially. And so I was able to describe life from the non-dual perspective, using or making very sure not to use words that implied duality, because it simply wasn't how life was being seen. And so the notion that what I am is awareness didn't seem to me like a concept. It seemed like the truth. The idea that all there is consciousness didn't seem like theory. It was how life was perceived, an understanding that whatever arises is dependent on awareness, arises within awareness, and essentially is awareness. So let's focus on these two. I am consciousness, and everything is consciousness. I am not the body. And I'll repeat, when I would make those claims, it wasn't based on what I thought was just theory, it was experiential, how I had come to see life and feel myself. And Ramesh said to me, "Don't be ridiculous, you're not consciousness, you're Roger." And there was this resistance to acknowledge myself as Roger, because it had taken years of devotion and dedication to the non-dual teachings that were telling me there is no Roger. Life is an illusion. It is a spontaneous arising in each moment. And at some point that became what I thought blatantly obvious, experientially. And when I was sitting there speaking with Ramesh, and maybe after, it became very clear, I can't acknowledge, I can't say the words, I am Roger. And he kept saying, you have to be practical. The teaching, he would say, is a practical teaching. It starts off by pointing out what is it that we're really looking for, what is available. And the assertion is what's available is peace of mind and daily living. Not enlightenment as a word or oneness as a state, but something very practical. And he said, if liberation or enlightenment doesn't deliver something practical, what's the point? And so as I was exploring the fact that I couldn't acknowledge that I am Roger, and yet with the aid of saying keep it practical, it helped me start to focus on the fact that to get to his satsang, a body walks up the steps and opens the door and sits down on a chair, and within that experience that can be perceived from, and was being perceived from, a particular perspective, there was still the sense that, well, but I'm also the body. And at that time it wasn't I am the body, but there is a body. And as we look at it more and more closely, we start to see that the world is very specifically seen through from the perspective of a particular body, and that it was this body sitting in the chair saying, no, I'm not Roger, I'm consciousness. And it struck me that, because a lot of these shifts happen when beliefs are looked at and life is questioned. What is reality? Who am I? And we look at our assumptions about life and realize that when we look at it from different perspectives, they don't hold true. Or they may not be true. So we have to say, well, I don't know that I am a person, that I'm a body. I don't know that the world is real. And as we start questioning the beliefs, we start to see how many of them there are. And shifts happen. And so the letting go of beliefs was a process I was extremely familiar with. And then it sort of, I bumped into a whole range of new beliefs that I hadn't seen. The belief that I am awareness. Now it didn't seem like a belief because it was what was being confirmed based on the new state of life that I had been told was reality. The old state was ignorance or illusion. So the new was reality, so I didn't question it. As I started to be a bit more honest and started to have some things pointed out to me, then attention started to focus on what I had assumed to be the truth, and looked at the concepts that were embedded in my system based on this assumption that what has revealed itself is the truth. And then I found this whole range of spiritual beliefs that had set in place. And luckily I had been quite devoted to the teachings of Ramana, and I remembered the saying, use this thorn to remove the thorn embedded in your thumb, and then be sure to throw both thorns away. The thorn referring to a spiritual concept used to uproot a deeply ingrained belief, which is a concept that has been taken to be absolutely true. So there's a difference in the simile that he's using. A thorn in the thumb is a concept that has turned into a belief. Use this thorn, which is the spiritual teaching. You are not the body, is the spiritual teaching. To uproot the deeply ingrained belief, I am the body. Or you are awareness. You are not the body, you are awareness. And then it says, be sure to throw both thorns away. And it says that because it knows that the thorn that is used to uproot the other thorn will get stuck and turned into a belief. The notion that cause and effect is absolute has been embedded in the thumb and has become a belief that only sees life one way. And so then the spiritual teaching will come along and say, cause and effect is unreal. Everything is spontaneously arising and subsiding. And so it uproots one and the other one gets put in place. So this keeping it practical is really important. Otherwise we see the new side of the coin, which is the theory. Now theory doesn't make it not true, but it doesn't make it practical. So in theoretical physics, quantum physics, the theory of quantum physics is probably accurate, but it's not what presents in practice. In practice, it is mechanical physics that is much more relevant. And sometimes we go past and see deeper than the mechanical physical laws and come to understand, or partially understand, that there is a whole range of different laws that can describe things. And then we say, oh, quantum physics is truth and mechanical physics is illusion. Whereas in reality, they are two sides of the coin, they're independent on each other, and the physical manifestation of quantum physics is mechanical physics. And they aren't two, they are two sides of one coin. Now, the awareness aspect of the human being hasn't been recognized by and large. We've grown up in life so focused on the objects of the world because of a belief that what I am is a physical entity that requires outcomes in order to be more complete than I am now. But there is this outward looking, and a very important aspect of the human being has been overlooked. A bit like only knowing mechanical physics. And so that, because it causes significant problems as far as human happiness goes, essentially it's a not knowing who we are. We have identified with one side of the coin, one side of who we are, and are looking at it as if it's absolute. So it causes a problem. We know ourselves in part, and we think we know ourselves fully. So the spiritual teachings say, I've got a job to do. I have to reveal this other aspect that has been overlooked, that has been forgotten. I have to break the obsession with the side that has been known. So it says that's not real, it's not who you are. That's ignorance. In order to bring about enough motivation in the system itself, because if the system itself isn't motivated, then the system won't persist. So it describes the knowing of oneself as enlightenment, as truth. All of these things are appealing to the system. They are motivation for it to look beyond what it has become obsessed with. And at some point there hopefully is an awakening to the aspect that had been overlooked. An aspect that is ever present in life, in daily living. We can't have experience of any sort without awareness, and yet, because it's so ever present, it fades into the background and is unseen. And by negating the objects and pointing at that which is aware of the objects, that which is aware of all of life can become aware of itself. And that, I suggest, is a recognition of a very important aspect of the human being that was previously unseen. And then I started saying, I am that aspect of the human being that was previously unseen, had become seen, led to a shift, and I was, in a way, as ignorant as I was before, because the intellect had made the same mistake of claiming to be awareness, which is an aspect of the human being. So what knowing ourself is about knowing ourself fully as a human being, which in this teaching is described as a biological instrument, the body, through which consciousness, impersonal consciousness of Source, functions. A biological instrument that the impersonal consciousness of Source has linked to, and is using the vehicle to experience life from the perspective of that instrument. So your perspective of life in any moment is the perspective that Source is having. Source isn't experiencing life from out there through CCTV type thing. It is the experience you're having right now. Source functioning through a particular body-mind organism. So to know that experience is to know your life. Not your whole life, your life right now. To know the Source which is functioning through you as awareness is to know that which is aware of life. Should the body die, the life experience collapses. The life experience known as Roger's life experience, infused by Rogeness, can no longer be the same because the instrument has dissolved. So to recognize that the life experience functioning through this particular body-mind is colored by the characteristics of this specific biological instrument. The visual aspects are determined by the quality of the eye machine. Some people have less sharp eyesight than others, which is just a result of the instrument through which the consciousness is functioning. The personality of the body becomes part of the experience. And so the experience has to be infused with the characteristics of the instrument. Now, in meditations, we can become more familiar with the impersonal aspect that is functioning through the body. In meditations, sometimes the characteristics of the instrument get turned off. The thinking can slow down, and there can become an awareness of what we could call an impersonal experience, because the personal flavor and characteristics have been turned off. So that's a part of the day where the personal components are not part of the experience. And often we have tended to think that the personal components of the experience are what the problem is. That the experience has to become less and less of the personal and more of the impersonal. Now that can be useful at a part of the journey in order for the core of the human being to become more and more recognized, more and more known and familiar to us, known that it is there at any moment. But then life, sort of the journey takes us full circle back to being the human being, where we know ourselves as the integration of both the vehicle and the consciousness as essentially one thing. So when an experience in meditation happens, or a daily life experience that is constructed quite differently to normal, where the consciousness, the awareness seems to separate and seems to be independent of the instrument. When we look more closely, we find even though it feels like that, it's not. I was very lucky in the most extreme oneness experience. My hands came up to cover the eyes. And what was being seen changed. Now that was very important, because in that particular experience, the sense of self was not located anywhere in the body, and it felt like life was being awared from everywhere. And so if that hadn't happened, I might still be questioning whether actually awareness is happening from outside the body, because that's what it felt like. And yet the hands came up and the fingers obscured what was being seen, so it became very obvious in hindsight, when I remembered that happening, that the perspective from which life was being seen was still using the body as the instrument, even though the experience felt very different. So even when there is an experience in daily life that seems like the awareness is separate from the body, a little more critical thinking, a little more careful observation will allow us to see that it's not as separate as it might feel. And then we might even realize that experiences, even of oneness, are maybe not as absolute as they seem. Maybe they are as subjective as the experience of duality or not oneness. They are just two different types of experience, and we shouldn't trust experience as a reflection of truth. And often we do. We have an experience of oneness, and then we carry forward a notion of what it revealed to me. If we're making the mistake of treating something subjective or relative as absolute, that's the same mistake that we made previously, the same principle error. So a revelation of the core of the human being that has been overlooked is very important. It can allow us to see life from a different perspective. That new perspective is not the truth or absolute. It then needs to be integrated with seeing life from a different perspective. And if that integration happens, we can, in my experience, live as the human being, knowing that the human being is a combination of the body, the thinking, the emotions, the personality, and the consciousness. Not as many different things, but as a combined unit. And so when we look at things more importantly and practically, what am I really looking for? The suggestion here is what is most uncomfortable and unacceptable in life is the suffering component of the life experience. The suffering that arises as our attitude towards the circumstance that we find ourselves in. As the circumstance, as our life progresses. It is the guilt and shame, the blame and hatred, the pride and arrogance, the worry and anxiety, the expectation and attachment to outcomes that arise and color the human experience. And when we find ourselves in very impersonal states, that thinking is absent and there is peace. We may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater in insisting that liberation is to know yourself as not the person. So in this teaching it makes it clear that the problem is not being a person, but rather the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So it's a very specific component that has established itself as a default within the personal structure. And that identity, that psychological belief system about who I am, based on a false interpretation of what life is, can dissolve. And if that dissolves, we can find ourselves reintegrating into the acceptance that I am a person, and that the person is the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a body-mind organism functioning and experiencing life from this perspective. That is the life experience. That Ramana continued to be a person until he died, responding to his name when it was called. But as the belief in personal doership dissolves, then there is a knowing one's connection to Source, always being connected to Source, understanding that whatever is said through this body-mind organism, whatever happens through this body-mind organism, is a happening according to Source, which means every time speaking is happening, I am connected to Source. Which means an active recognition of my connection to Source whenever the body is doing anything. So everyone is always connected to Source. Source is always functioning through everyone. The same impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through 7 billion human instruments. And we have forgotten. We have lost the recognition that we are connected to Source. That Source is living us. Source is functioning through us. So there is no issue with recognizing I am a person, but I am not a separate, independent person, disconnected. I am an instrument through which Source is functioning, and that is the person. The deep recognition that no one ever does anything of their own volition means the end of hatred and rivalry and competition. The end of self-hatred in the form of shame and guilt. And the end of blame towards the other for what has happened through them that has delivered pain. And that's where the peace in daily living stems from. The actions of the other are no longer seen to be an attack on who I am, because that connection to Source reveals that circumstance is much less important than it felt to be previously, when I only knew myself as a physical entity that required pleasure in order to be more complete. So life is a happening, moment after moment after moment, a predetermined happening according to God's will. One of Ramana's descriptions was, everything happens according to the great ordainer, according to the body karma. Whatever is destined to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to stop it from happening, it will happen. No matter what is, whatever is not destined to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it happen, it will not happen. Recognizing this, knowing this, means the best course of action is to remain silent. And the silence he's talking about is the inner silence of the judging mind that says, this should have happened, this shouldn't have happened, I should have done this, you should have done that. Politicians should be doing this. The world should be heading in this direction, not that direction. All of that is noise that doesn't appreciate that everything that is happening according to the great ordainer. And the absence of that recognition creates a sense of separation. So if we start looking at things practically, we can start to see what the problem is in life and focus on becoming more and more aware, thanks to the descriptions that are delivered in teachings, of what the problem is and how it changes. Understanding what can change. So the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That is the nature of the flow of life, and it's not going to change. So life is not suddenly going to become pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. However, our attitude towards the flow of life, when we investigate it, is the level on which all the suffering arises, The suffering in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation doesn't arise on the level of circumstance. It only ever arises on the level of our attitude to circumstance. And in any moment that can stop. That can be cut off. And it starts getting cut off when it's understood that the basis on which the attitude from which suffering arises are false beliefs. The belief in being a separate, independent doer that is dependent on outcomes in order to be complete. When that belief is investigated and seen to be erroneous, that becomes the beginning of the end of suffering. Because when the suffering arises, it is seen to be a narrative based on an error. Now, the deeply ingrained belief can be exactly that, deeply ingrained. And so the vasanas and some samskaras can carry on for some time, playing themselves out. So the old stories, the old reactions can continue to unfold, but hopefully there is an aspect of our system that can recognize them for what they are. Destiny unfolding. They too are part of life that is a creation according to God's will. So the suffering that arises is part and parcel of the creation. It seems like this is a journey of forgetting oneself, suffering, remembering oneself, and the suffering coming to an end. So I'll try and speak less today, which I've done. Less than I use, which means more time for questions. So if people have questions, then the questions often answer questions in other people's minds, and it helps to elaborate and explain usually with examples what's being spoken about.
Thank you. So I would just like to recognize that what you've been sharing, I also feel a resistance to see that, to come back and also take responsibility for my body and mind, because I was practicing this kind of absolutist kind of practice thing. And I look at why I was doing that, and I can see there was suffering because I was not getting results in life that I wanted. So I wanted to stop that, and I couldn't get better. I couldn't get as good as I wanted. Mm-hmm. So I saw that this was a way out. Mm-hmm. And to quite a large extent, like you say, if you see yourself as impersonal awareness, then it's, the thinking doesn't arise, and whatever is going on is fine. Mm-hmm. So my question is also, when you come back to this, and if you still say that, okay, this is my set of conditioning, and I can still say that's me. It's conditions. It's not. There's no separate me. It's conditions, and that's conditions. Everyone has conditions, but still there is space for comparison. Then, as this set of conditions being inferior than another.
So the capacity to discern differences doesn't go away. The intellect remains, and in fact the intellect is a very important gift that the human being has. So if I see the other performing a task that I would like to do, let's say painting a painting, and they do it well, and I paint and I don't do it very well, I can discern that that person's skills in painting are better than mine. As soon as comparison comes in, which is different to discerning, but saying they're better than mine, therefore I'm not good enough, or I want to be as good as they are and I'm not, that is based on the deeply ingrained belief of attachment to outcomes, which really means that we know ourselves, or we believe that my completeness is to be found in results in life, in outcomes. And if we set our self-identity up, if our self-identity has been set up that way, we are forced to want ourselves to be good and sometimes perfect, which is it's an attitude that is bound to lead to frustration, because as I've described in other satsangs, the human being is a result, in practical terms, a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it is your genes and up-to-date conditioning that will determine exactly as you are in each moment, which includes your painting skills, let's say. And we weren't in control of our genes or our up-to-date conditioning, and we're not in control of the results of what happens in life. So this description is saying, well, if you set up and run around with the expectation that you be different to the way you are, that expectation is going to cause uncomfortableness. So if that expectation falls away, that doesn't mean that you will stop functioning according to your biological conditions. So you can still do your best in a situation. This description of seeing yourself as you are means a recognition, well, I am one way, the other is the way they are. So the great painter is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. I'm a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And therefore, I can either accept myself as that, or I can run a psychological fantasy that I should be better. The psychological fantasy is going to create suffering. So when you move into the impersonal, the psychological fantasy gets cut off. There's no need for it. But what is happening is you're bypassing your experience of being human, which is a shame. When we come back and accept ourselves as human, which then means I can enjoy the pleasures and pains of life. So when pleasure is delivered, I get to enjoy it. When pain is there, I have to endure it. And we feel, wow, there's so much more flavor in being human than being impersonal awareness. Now, if that flavor includes the uncomfortableness, then it might seem better to go back to the impersonal. But what if we can come back to the personal and see the specific components that create the uncomfortableness and find, as part of your makeup, a diminishing of that aspect? That's what. So your question, for example, might help show us that the expectation is what's the problem. If you drop the expectation of being better, it doesn't mean that your skill sets that you do have will fall away. They'll still be there, and you can function according to your makeup, which could include some good skills. And if you see an advertisement for art school with this understanding, it doesn't mean you won't have the feeling to join a 2-week workshop. But you will do it knowing that the outcome is not in your control. That at the end of the 2-week workshop, that 2-week workshop is new conditioning that will change your up-to-date conditioning, but it's based on your existing genes and up-to-date conditioning. So you might find that your structure is just not suited to being an artist. So if that's the case, you go to 2 weeks of workshop, and at the end of it, you're still not a great artist. If you feel like going to the workshop, go to the workshop, understand that the outcome is not in your control. You might find that you come out a much better artist. So this change of attitude doesn't at all mean stop doing your best. It's if it gets taken on by someone where a complacency sets in, like, oh well, it's all just predetermined, that description has been heard by a part of the intellect that is not really hearing it as it's meant to be. So comparison is a sure way to feel inadequate. If you turn off television, if you turn off social media, if you find yourself in a place where there isn't much to compare yourself, you'll find yourself much happier. Because the ingrained habit to compare yourself is not being fed by external stimuli that will allow you to compare. And then in time you can turn those mediums back on and hopefully find that the recognition that life is so much better when there is no comparison means that the system just doesn't do it anymore because it doesn't make sense. It understands that a connection to oneself is where the true fulfillment comes from. And for as long as this psychological movement of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, and so what you've described fits under expectation and guilt. Guilt, I'm not good enough. Guilt and shame. And expectation is, oh, I need to be good enough in order to feel at peace or happy. And often that has to do with an attachment to love, feeling like when the others love me, once I have proved myself, then I will get the respect and the love from others, and then everything will be okay. So this attachment to love is one of the basic outward-looking directions that keeps us disconnected from ourselves.
So I still, you mentioned that being pulled back as the impersonal awareness, there I'm missing out on full flavor of life. I might not be able to phrase it exactly, but that's what I understood, that I wouldn't be able to experience the pain and pleasure to its full extent. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the case, if that's what maybe I'm feeling that what you're suggesting, that I should also come to the personal and place the fulfillment, like you're saying, the fulfillment of myself not coming through the person. That's if that's to be found in the impersonal self, mm-hmm. then I don't see why I have the need to come to the body-mind and say this is also, like, to place identification with it. Mm-hmm. And because it is not that it is not, I'm not aware of these things. I have a 2-year-old daughter and I'm very active in life, so of course I'm not just sitting with my eyes closed. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what you're saying in that.
So let's not mistake what I'm saying as a resting in self is a problem or not important. It's the part of ourself that we've forgotten, And so if you've found contact with that, that's very important. So an abiding in I am, recognizing the self, meaning the formless awareness, what Ramana would refer to as self with a capital S, and what Nisargadatta would refer to as awareness or consciousness, I am. Abiding in I am, resting in the self, as often as is possible, is really important to create a connection to that place. And that is the place where we can drop out of suffering. So if you find yourself comparing, you can drop into the impersonal, and the suffering either just dissipates or can get cut off, or if it remains, it can be witnessed as a happening in that awareness, and there's no identification with it. So where I started the satsang is not to say any dropping into the impersonal is ignorance. It is to say that we can get carried away with with a recognition, and then the intellect can create some concepts like I am self or I am awareness that are not aligned with the actuality of things. So if the actuality of things are that you are a person, and that person can shift through different states, where the person can, at night there is a dream state, and so the person is dreaming. In meditation, the experience is an experience of not very much, let's say, nothingness or self in that nothingness. And so we recognize that the person does have changing states throughout the day. So in all of that, hopefully there isn't a negation of the person. A negation of the doership and attachment to outcomes, that part of the person that is thinking, is what slowly gets cut off. And it can get cut off because there is a movement towards resting in our own being. At some point we need to ensure that that doesn't become the be-all, end-all objective, where we think that liberation is a movement towards more and more nothingness until it is so nothing that there's nothing. So the awakening to self can happen for someone, and it's not really that big a deal, actually. And then the thought is, oh, I'm sure that I'll know the self more if I practice more. And so then the objective is for there to be less and less of the person. And so what I'm pointing out here is that at some point, hopefully we become aware whether we're falling into that trap. We have to question, is it a trap? Or is liberation really about perfecting the meditation state so that one day something happens and who knows, I don't ever come back? Or because these ideas, we can have all sorts of ideas, because the awakening teachings are reinforcing and saying, the self is the only truth, for example. The self is all there is. In order for us to rest there. Remember that Sri Sheshadri Swamigal went and tapped Ramana on the head after 10 years of him being in samadhi. Said, come. Ramana, but I was really nothing, and now you're pulling me out. So that might be something that makes us think, actually, maybe we shouldn't, maybe the process isn't about being, just keep, a continuous movement out, 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 out.
now I feel what you're saying is actually more freeing than because I can recognize there was in fact suffering in that. With this movement of wanting to be more and more.
Exactly. That's when you look at it. It's that wanting to be more and more nothing, or find the void, or whatever ideas we have, is an expectation of what enlightenment is that might be completely misguided.
Just that when I experience a person.
If you just for the recording's sake.
When I do experience the person, in fact, this is one of the questions that has been burning for me in the recent time. I feel I experience that as a problem. That very much answers the.
Yeah. So now, hopefully, there can be a recognition of what is what disturbs our peace of mind is not the whole person, but a specific type of what is referred to in this teaching as the thinking mind, a specific type of thinking that the person does. And so you've identified one aspect of it, comparison. And so in the teaching it makes it very clear that it's the doership and attachment to outcome. So Ramesh would say, so what will you have after enlightenment that you didn't have before? In practical terms, say, before enlightenment there was a person. He used the word ego, different to the way it's used in other teachings. So before enlightenment there is a person, or ego, with the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcomes. After enlightenment there will still be a person, an ego, but whereby the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome has been completely uprooted. Before, the belief in doership and attachment to outcome creates an attitude to life that is filled with guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. And as that aspect of the person dissolves, the suffering stops. So now we can say, actually, I have to embrace the personal, but recognize that it's the doership and attachment to outcome that is part of the person that disturbs the peace of mind. And don't turn the end of doership and attachment to outcome into an expectation. Because if you turn it into an expectation, there will be an attitudinal resistance to suffering when it arises, which is just more suffering. But understand, it is an availability for life to start undoing the beliefs that life has put in place. So really, the story of life as a predetermined story created the individual with those deeply ingrained beliefs. And as the story of life continues, that story might include the dissolving of the beliefs and the release and the relief from suffering. So that's destiny, whether that happens or not something that you control. But Ramesh would say, given that destiny has put us in a situation where our genes and up-to-date conditioning drives us to sit in satsang, we can consider ourselves one of God's favorites in a way. And there's no need to be pessimistic about whether destiny will take the deeply ingrained beliefs away, because it's already doing, and it's already revealing a life that is different to the life of many others out there who aren't finding motivation as part of their life story, as part of their destiny to undergo this inquiry.
Thank you.
Okay, there, and you can go next.
Thank you for your talk. I haven't attended the first one, so I'm not sure what the take is on who I am. What does the teaching tell us about who we are?
The question, who am I, is there for us primarily to recognize the aspect of who we are that hasn't been recognized. So by and large, that is the awareness, the deeper core of the human being, the place in which we can rest and be. So the formless, and so countless teachings are pointing us in that direction so that there can be a connection to that part of the human being. So the question, who am I, is really there to reveal the aspect that has been overlooked. And so until there is a path to the heart forged, then we should relate to the question, who am I, as a pointer towards the formless awareness and the impersonal sense of I am or being. Once that has revealed itself, hopefully there is an integration between that and the biological and psychological entity, which includes the feelings, the emotions, and the thinking. And we come to know ourselves as a human being, which in this teaching is described as a three-dimensional body-mind organism through which consciousness has linked and is functioning.
So my question really wasn't about what is the answer to who am I in other teachings. What I'm specifically saying is, like, in this teaching, the who am I is like I am the human being, and I hadn't acknowledged that I had another aspect, which was the intangible, or what you just described. Is that what you're saying? That,
and yes, more particularly, it says you are the human being, but you are not a separate, independent doer. That's the most important part of it. You are not a separate, independent doer. Whatever happens through you is a result of God's will.
So then you are separate from God. You're not the doer. God is the doer, and you are, in some way linked with the doer, but there's still a degree of, I'm just trying to understand it.
So
it's not against it or anything.
If everything, so it comes down to our understanding of what God is. If we imagine a God out there, and then me in here, and then God controlling, then that sort of creates a separateness and a two-ness. So to try and get beyond that, the teaching says, okay, life in broad sense is more like this: impersonal consciousness of source, the unmanifest. So the unmanifest, source at rest, pure potentiality. So before the manifestation, before all of this happened, source in its unmanifest form, pure potentiality. At some point, that pure potentiality explodes into manifestation. So you can say God, or source at rest, becomes the whole of manifestation, source in movement, in an instant.
So which one do I identify myself with if I had to gun to my head? Now, which one am I?
There's no question of which one. There is God at rest as absolute nothing, no manifestation, at some point becomes the whole manifestation. So God has become you and me, and the tree, and the ocean, and the birds, and the whole damn lot. God has turned into, so God is source, it's energy. And as created objects, we can never know the creator source.
So what about the darshan of God? If we want to have a darshan of God, because there is a thirst in the being to connect with God.
Yes, so then maybe question it as an expectation based on our understanding of life as a duality. So this description here is God has become the manifestation. And so sometimes, I saw the other day someone walking around with a t-shirt saying, "I am God," on his t-shirt. And the first response I had is, not quite. But I understand, what is being said. So often there is this, this misunderstanding. If everything is one and everything is God turned into everything, well then I am God. But in practical terms, that's like, the peach on the tree saying, I am the entire tree. We are an expression of the source. A bit like the wave on the ocean analogy. If the wave says it is the entire ocean, I go, not quite. But the recognition is that the wave is made of the same stuff as the ocean. But it's not the entire ocean. So the human being can't say, I am God, but God is me. Yeah. We don't have God powers to know the universe, to change things. The closest we can come to knowing Source is to know that the Source in manifestation, the awareness and the sense of existence that is at our core, that we can drop into in meditation. And it doesn't need to be meditation when you're walking in life. When we're just talking here, there can be a connection to the I amness, the beingness, and a recognition of the awareness. And so that is to know, if you want, you could say to know God in manifest form. To want to know God any more than that is an expectation of the human being that is based on what I would say some misunderstanding. So take a dream at night. The dream character might have this yearning to know it's God. And so in the analogy, the God of the dream is the person asleep in the bed. The dream character and the person asleep in bed are never going to meet.
There is that moment when you waking up where they do kind of merge. You wake up and you see that I was the one that was dreaming and I created this character, right?
But we have to get more specific, because the dream character is never going to be on the same plane as the human being, and they're going to have a conversation looking at it. The dream character is not going to ever know the color of the eyes of the dreamer. Yeah. We have to understand that the created object can never know the creator subject. These misnomers are so understandable why they happen. It's not anyone's fault. It's part of destiny. And as we start to realize certain things that we thought were possible and see that they're not possible, then that expectation falls away. And a lot of the spiritual confusion starts to fall away, and then the seeking becomes more and more focused. So when we're exploring the notion of source at rest, we think, one day I will know source at rest. Source at rest is where source is not even aware of itself. Absolute nothing. If someone thinks that they have experienced absolute nothing, they're misinterpreting another peak experience. Because if someone has the experience of what they call absolute nothing, was nothing close to absolute nothing, because there was awareness of what is being called nothing, which really might have been the absence of visual and sound and so. But there was awareness, so that is in the manifestation. the absolute is the falling away of awareness, where source isn't even aware of itself. And within the manifestation, seekers are expecting that one day they will know the absolute, or know source in the most absolute sense, which is not something that even source doesn't know itself in that state.
Okay, that's just causing me to wonder, if source doesn't know itself because it's still sleeping, how can a seeker or a master even know that there is a source and he's sleeping? Because he doesn't even know it. And the entities that he's dreaming up, you and me, and masters, how do they even know that there is a source and he's sleeping and he's dreaming us up?
You see, when I say source doesn't know itself, there's no problem with that. That's not an ignorance or a delusion.
No, I understand that.
So it's not sleeping where it will wake up. That's its most natural state, let's say, most basic state. And it isn't still sleeping. In the manifestation, it has gone from its potential state into the manifest. So now source is aware of itself through each human being. What I'm saying is that in the manifest, the human being then thinks that that one day it will know the unmanifest. And what I'm pointing at is that the manifest will become the unmanifest when nothing is known. Nothing can ever be known. So I'm just hoping that fewer people will be waiting to know the unmanifest, which is a mission impossible.
I understand all of what you're saying. There's no contention, no argument to it. I'm just wondering, how do we know this? How do we know all this?
It's all a story.
No, even this. How
Yeah.
do we know this? How
all,
did they get this knowledge? And
this is,
you know what I mean?
everything that's put forward is a concept, not the truth. Right? Very important for that to be thrown in. Whatever is said by anyone, no matter how big a master in life, whatever they say or write down is a concept and not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So that concept, so what's just been said there, talking about concepts and truth in the manifestation, is itself a concept. It's a very important concept if one says, why is it included? So when I'm talking about the unmanifest, and you say, how do you know? I agree with you completely. I say, it's a story, it's a concept, it's not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So if you hear that the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am, maybe you'll say, well, actually I should focus on that. And the whole point of talking about the unmanifest is people are focusing on the unmanifest. And the concept suggests that the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am, and even that is a concept. But it's worth following.
Thank you.
So my question is, how do you identify intuition? I mean,
what was the word? How do you identify?
Intuition.
Intuition. Yeah.
I mean, how do you distinguish between a intuitive thought or a thought arising from a person? How do I distinguish between that? Whether it is my mind or whether it is something intuitive.
Mm.
So, how to identify that? So, This is my question.
Well, there's also a presupposition in your question that intuition is not the person's.
Right. So, what I have known about intuition is that it comes from a peaceful state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
A thought arising from a peaceful state of mind, calm state of mind,
Mm-hmm.
Which is the right thing that is going to happen to you at the right time. So something which feels so right, but at times it might be deceiving, like something out of my conditioning. There is some desire inside that might take a shape of, intuitive thought and deceive a person.
Yeah. So some of the things I say around intuition is that one, it's much less absolute than we think of it as much more absolute than it actually is. So intuition has a very different quality to different types of thinking, to different types of, let's just say thought. It feels very different because it is different, but it's not infallible. Right? So if you watch what you call your intuition, you could be walking in the forest and you're lost, and you allow your thinking about which way to go to fall away, and then you feel like an intuition that it's to the right, and you might find yourself more lost. It can happen. Now that's not because that thought wasn't really intuition and it was deceiving. It's because intuition is not infallible. I would say that intuition is a faculty of the human being that is exactly what you said. It isn't being directed by the thinking mind. And the thinking mind usually says, I know how everything works, this is how it works, and it's sort of got life pretty wrong, and it thinks it's got it spot on. And so when that falls away, a more intelligent aspect gets to function, our intuition. We start to feel more than think. And I'm talking about the thinking mind that says, this is what I need, this is the best way to get it. And then it blocks out any other information from the body. And that's unfortunate because that part of our thinking is not that intelligent. It blocks out an intelligence that is in the body. And so more often that we can bypass what is often egoic thinking, let's say, the thinking of the self, the more intelligence in the body can function and can present itself, and intuition is one way that intelligence happens. So if we're looking for a connection to intuition in order for us to get pleasure, that's another way that our attachment to outcome, thinking that what we need is pleasure, has snuck in the back door. So when we function where we allow life to live us, where we have recognized that let me do what I feel, let me not necessarily do what my thinking mind, or based on all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, we drop into we find that I'm moving much more intuitively, you can say. I feel like I'm being lived. But that movement isn't going to mean that you're being lived and suddenly everything is pleasure. But it means you're much more in flow with life. So even if the outcome is not perfect in terms of your biological preferences, what will be delivered, which is very valuable, is this sense of being connected and in flow. And then the outcomes become less important.
That's right. But sometimes what happens is, like, if your desire for something is very strong, that also feels right at times.
Yeah.
So Yeah, so I mean, this is a conflict actually. I mean, at that point of time, you feel that it's something is feeling right, so it might be intuition.
Yes,
So,
it's a good point. So one of the descriptions that was most helpful for me was the description about suffering. And apart from saying suffering comes in practical terms in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, a more general description is that suffering is always an uncomfortableness with oneself and the other, ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself. So once awareness and the intellect start landing on the uncomfortable feeling, so desire is linked to attachment to outcomes, where we feel, in order for me to be complete, I need that, and then strong desire for that, a craving for that sets in. And when that craving kicks in, it's telling you, the craving is saying, what you need is that, and it feels like truth. And so that's what you're saying, is it can be confusing because my whole system was shouting out, what you need is that object, that pleasure, and it feels like truth. Now, if it's coming from attachment to outcome, desire, expectation, that bundle, and remember, Buddha's brief summary of enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is attachment. The cause of suffering is desire, and the cause of desire is attachment. And attachment really means my completeness is to be found in sex, or my completeness is to be found in money, or my completeness is to be found in a soulmate. Anything that is coming from that attachment to outcome is going to feel uncomfortable. Maybe not in the moment, because it's screaming out that that is what you need. But after you pursue it, there will be a sense of lack, probably, because you'll get what you, maybe you get what you have desired, and you find it doesn't deliver what the feeling was telling you it would deliver. And so it's very important for your discernment, your attention to land on that and to realize, oh, here's the uncomfortableness. And I see that this uncomfortableness, it could be shame, let's say. It could be the simple fact that you get it and it doesn't deliver what you thought it was going to deliver. So as we become more and more familiar with the uncomfortableness of self, uncomfortableness is not talking about pain, it's talking about a sense of, I'll just keep using the word uncomfortableness. When I touched in on the suffering, that's such a good word for suffering, for all of the forms of suffering. It's an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other in the form of blame towards the other, and ultimately the uncomfortableness of blame is really an uncomfortableness with oneself. So as the uncomfortableness is something that we become familiar with, then there is our radar sort of gets calibrated to understand the uncomfortableness. And then that feeling that is full of desire, which at first we don't feel the uncomfortableness in it, and we only see the uncomfortableness afterwards. As we become more familiar with uncomfortableness, desire starts screaming uncomfortableness. When that feeling of, I need that, that's what will complete me, when it's coming from attachment to outcome, we say, wow, this is so uncomfortable relative to peace of mind. So becoming aware of uncomfortableness, the uncomfortableness of suffering, is very important, because when you're in the flow of life, moving from a place that is not driven by attachment to outcome and doership, then the uncomfortableness isn't there. And as soon as that kicks in, we feel, it's disturbed, the connection, the flow. And knowing that then means that less and less of those impulses are followed. So when they're really strong, no point trying to resist it because it will cause more suffering. So you can surrender to it and say, I have to do this because the desire is so strong. But then there's times when the desire is borderline and you realize this is suffering and you don't go in the direction that you previously would have. And that effectively is your understanding of what is coming from desire and as opposed to what is coming from the absence of doership and attachment.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you very much for practical teaching. I appreciate very much. But my question is not so practical. Do you think souls just want to experience through our body and mind organism? Or there is some intention or desire, I don't know what is the word, but evolution of consciousness is somehow source wants to, or there is some big picture.
So I will answer it based on just an observation, which doesn't make it an absolute answer, but if we see what the story of life is, it is a story of evolution. So even if, and remember, these are not the truth necessarily, because some things at some point we really start to say, how do we know? But it's a very useful framework. So if, like a lot of non-duality and mystical spiritual teachings say, life is a spontaneous happening. So even when you start looking at the quantum field in science, at least one half of this supports the spontaneous happening rather than the causality model. So if we look at life as a spontaneous creation, the whole of time, the whole of the story of life created in an instant. And now the human being is experiencing, the human being or source experiencing what it created, the story it created, from the perspective of each human being. When we look at what the story is that has been created, whether we see it as created from beginning of time to end of time, meaning 14 billion years or whatever it is, or whether we see it as each moment spontaneously created, when we look at what presents, we see it as a story of one, time and space, even if that is just an illusion because it's in the story. When we're being practical because we are part of the story, and when we're really practical, say, I'm looking for happiness for this human being in this life, in this story, right? I'm not looking for happiness outside of the story. So that's why we have to start being practical with what's here. So even if it is a spontaneous creation, which is the theory, when we come down to the practice of what has been created and we look, we see, well, time is part of the framework, at least from one perspective. Then there is a evolution. If we look at what was happening in the 800s, people were much more brutal as a whole than they are today. Now, there's still a lot of brutality today, so I'm not saying that there's less, but we are moving away. We are becoming, so if you look at Neanderthal man and even animals, there is less intellect component that can evolve consciousness, which is being used in a different terminology. So this story of life is a story of evolution. And so when Buddhas arise, they are the beginning of the evolution of consciousness. They are the lights, one or two, that go back 5,000 years. We have some accounts of, or and as that information comes out into life, then more and more lights come on. And so we can say that this particular manifestation seems to be a story of evolution, including an evolution of consciousness. So I wouldn't say that Source wants to become more conscious, but rather it has turned into a story, maybe one of infinite number of stories, but we know this one, we're in this one. And when we look at it, we see this is a story of time and space and evolution. And one of the evolutions is the evolution of consciousness, remembering the core of the human being and suffering becoming less. And the suffering is an internal suffering, but at the same time as an internal suffering becomes less, there is more interest in seeing the other also happy. And so systems of socialism or even communism may one day become natural. They haven't worked because the human being hasn't evolved to a point where what we are can accept those models as being valid. The egoic part, the doership and attachment to outcome part, is still driving economies that are based on growth and more consumption and inequality between people. And as the consciousness of humans evolves, so that's not the awareness and the sense of being, that doesn't change, that doesn't evolve. So if we're using the word consciousness to refer to the awakening to oneself, that doesn't evolve. But the combination of that plus the body-mind instrument, the body-mind, that does evolve. And so then preserving nature becomes more of a priority. And seeing that everyone is looked after by the fruits of the land without us claiming it as my land and not your land, that I feel, if humanity survives long enough, will become normal. So really in that journey, our job is to recognize and change internally. I leave, in a way, I say, it's great that there are activists that are attached to outcomes. They keep some balance in things, but the biggest quantum leaps are going to happen when people forget about the outcomes, work on themselves, and once enough of humanity has cleared out its doership and attachment, then big change will happen automatically. Mm.
In terms of that last part, I hope that we can evolve quick enough for that to be the case before we terminate ourselves on the planet. I wanted to restate what I think is the essence of what you were saying in a slightly different way, just to see if I've got it right. Mm-hmm. Using the model of a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Mm-hmm. Thesis, I am a separate individual consciousness. Antithesis or antithesis, I am impersonal consciousness. Synthesis, I am impersonal consciousness manifesting through separate individual consciousness.
Yes.
Okay. In the individual part of that, the thesis part, obviously there's no awareness, or typically, the person, we could say the person is living on the surface. Mm-hmm. In the I am antithesis part of it, we could say the person's living in the depth. Mm-hmm. In the synthesis part, you could say you're living in the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I think that's essentially it.
So actually what I've left out, strangely enough, in describing the human being is part of the synthesis. It's to know ourselves as the human being, which is impersonal consciousness of source, linked to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So funnily enough, I left out as personal consciousness, which is really part of the overall description. And I think that matches what you're saying pretty well. But the thing is that sometimes we can't put the cart before the horse, because if the impersonal hasn't been recognized, then there really is no question of synthesizing the two.
Right.
So in a way, this teaching is here because very clearly there are a lot of people, especially now with the advent of these non-dual teachings and awakening teachings being put out there in forms on YouTube and things like that, where it's so accessible. There are a lot of people waking up, and there are a lot of people that are very devoted to that teaching for what it has done. And I see a lot of people, you just have to go into some Facebook groups to see that there is a lot of signs of people becoming overly identified with the thesis, the antithesis part, and now a synthesis is required. But for example, let's assume with Ramana, I think we can say that the synthesis had happened, although he had a very strong antithesis tendency. And then seeing people come to him, what they need is the awakening. So there's no point in talking about the integration. So the awakening teachings, the same with Nisargadatta, what he put forward, he would exclaim adamantly, "I am not the body. I am awareness. Don't project your idea of yourself onto me when you're asking these questions." And was quite emphatic where you could maybe question whether the synthesis has happened. But I rather just take the perspective where I say, don't even go there. I don't need to go there. I just say, what was needed then was the awakening. And so that's what the teaching put forward. But it seems like times are changing.
Now, in terms of people waking up to the impersonal consciousness, if they are bypassing, to use the term you used, or in denial of the personal, it can lead to all the, what we could call negative playing out of repressed stuff that's allowed to run free, all the bad behavior we see amongst teachers.
Yeah.
I think part of that is because of failure of the synthesis. It hasn't happened. So there's all this repressed stuff over here that hasn't been integrated with the depth here. The surface and the depth haven't come together.
Yes.
But there are people who dive into that depth and manifest qualities that I don't think you've really touched on here, such as an overflowing outpouring of love, for instance. Or they feel the pleasures and pains of a human life much more intensely than they might have previously, but they are free of identification with it. So I just want to bring those out because those seem to be, very positive possibilities that seem to belong to the depth part of the triangle. But I don't think you'd really touched on those. So I just wanted to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I think there are definitely human beings on this planet that are here with a very specific role, and so their development is skewed in a direction that allows them to fulfill that role, which means they do exhibit very strong qualities of a very specific aspect, like this overflowing of love. Maybe it's just in order to get people to stay around them because it feels good. Maybe it's that resonance actually is changing the structure of those that are in that proximity. And the danger is when it is assumed that that specific characteristic in those people is the epitome of enlightenment, let's say, the epitome of enlightenment. That's when, and then our idea of what is available for us becomes based on what a specific, unusual, even unusual within the enlightened realm, let's say, without recognizing that they, in their destiny, in the destiny of humanity, have a very specific role to play. So I think that gets corrected in time for a seeker if focus comes on to peace of mind, the end of suffering, because any mistake that we might make of what it might be, and then if we sort of pursue that instead of peace of mind, as I'm putting forward in peace of mind for the human being, at some point it starts feeling uncomfortable, like Chetan was saying, when you're out in the I amness, at some point it starts to feel like something's a little off if it becomes bypassing. And so the first part, it's not really bypassing. The first part is where you are grounding into that, such that it becomes very familiar and available. And then at a certain point, if it is escaping those energies in the body that need to be processed and released and seen relative to certain descriptions, like those of doership and attachment to outcomes, if it becomes a bypassing, then that energy sort of starts to make its way to the surface, even in the witnessing state, I think, and we start to feel a bit uncomfortable, and that's when we start to question. And then if someone who's questioning it hears this, they go, of course, that's why I'm feeling uncomfortable. And maybe there's a movement back into the body where these things can get processed more efficiently. And there's teachers that I think now, with this notion that you've brought in, are teaching too soon, because they have awakening, believing that that's it, that's what liberation is about, and then they start describing and teaching the awakening when the process hasn't really happened, and the vasanas and samskaras are still in play, and how it gets sort of rationalized that there's no one here, it's just happening, you shouldn't be taking it personally. And we don't know, that could be very valid, it could be very enlightening for the person receiving that's sort of getting spewed out with the wisdom. But it seems like there's a movement now within spiritual circles and it's a funny area, because you can't really assert control over these things, but there is a movement where people are putting more emphasis on integrity and clarity, let's say, or making sure the job has been done, or at least I don't think the job ever gets done. I think you keep learning in life, but at least till very specific major milestones have been reached. We'll make this the last question if we can.
Yeah, that process you're describing of coming back from identification with consciousness, would you describe that as like a final letting go of the need to use the mind as an instrument to define who you are? Because it seems like it's the wrong apparatus for actually I mean, the mind's all right for kind of everyday life, but to actually know the real nature of ourselves, isn't the right tool for the job, you know. And it just seems like the final, you know, the need to constantly define who we are. Kind of when we let go of that and from a mind kind of perspective and just kind of sink into what we actually are, it could be brings you back down into kind of back into full circle, like you say.
Yeah, so a large part of that, although it's not absolute, happens in the awakening phase, because for the awakening to happen, there's a lot of intellectual changes that have to happen where we're not labeling things in the way we used to label them. We're not saying this is right and this is wrong. So it's a seeing of things just as they are, which is a moving away from the mind to, you know stuff. That's a very important part of what brings about awakening, is the notion, I don't know. You know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. But to me, when I don't know gets overused, in a sense, it becomes a problem in itself. So, because there are things that in the synthesis, in the integration, there are things that we know, not in an absolute sense, but if we just keep saying I don't know, it's a problem. So, for example, to come back and say, so come back, and then to not use the mind, and say, well, I don't know if I'm a human being. To me, I would say it's not about using the mind to make statements that are non-confirmable. But when you really let go of a lot of stuff and you just come back and allow experience to inform you, and you say, well, actually I go to bed each night as the human being, I wake up in the same bed in the morning. And the earlier part of the process required us to even challenge that, right? And say, well, how do I know that the room exists when I'm sleeping in the bed? That's part of the awakening, is to go, I don't even know that. And that's when the I don't know, if it's carried on too long, can go too far, because so even things like the notion of God, right? We might still have this idea that there is a God that created all of this. Like the story I've been putting forward talks about God. At some point, you have to say, well, actually, I don't know that this was created like the non-dual teachings tell me. As far as I'm concerned, it makes sense that the consciousness may actually be a consciousness of the brain of the human being. When we look at it, we go, why did I believe that? So coming back to I might be undoing everything that happened in this satsang. Sorry about that.
It just seems like there's a different type of knowing that doesn't involve the intellect, or it's like I was saying the last time I spoke, more like a feeling, which for me is my kind of confirmation.
Yeah.
Like when you describe your, like the other side of the, the antithesis, it's kind of like you're describing it like from an intellectual, but there's kind of something else that goes with it as well, like beneath that, which is kind of a feeling, knowing more, it's so what I was trying to get at is maybe you don't need to kind of define it and just go with the feeling.
Yeah, I'm very happy with that, because that's 9/10 or 99 hundredths of it, or That's the most important thing, for sure. You know, if anything's getting in the way of, that's what I am that I am. Right. That's in a way God. You know, God, the burning, I am that I am, is basically saying, using a concept. What you're saying is like, don't put any concepts on it. I just know what I am, and I don't even know what I am. But and then there's no real question, right? I'm happy to run with that. That's very nice.
Yeah, it seems like we, you know, it's just the way that we kind of can be wired to constantly need to kind of define things and put labels on them, and maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not saying anything more.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is quite a profound talk. Will this be put on YouTube?
Yes, yeah, I think so. We had a power break halfway through, I think, but maybe it recorded, who knows. But yeah, most of it will be on YouTube. So I'll just finish that other thing. Is at some point, when we really get used, like, and we really come back to practical, like, because practical has proved to be more important than theory, which wasn't the case earlier on, and we drop more and more beliefs, like even the notion of God. I say, well, I know I am, and I don't know where that comes from. When I rest in I amness, it doesn't tell me that it wasn't born and it won't die. It doesn't tell me that it came from Source or God. And then we say, well, maybe it's all part of the body, and you know, what arises in awareness is feedback from an outside world arising inside the consciousness of Roger, a human being. And the more we are open to that, because we've developed the faculty of critical thinking and not believing stuff, and we say, why on earth would I believe what might actually be Santa Claus stories when a notion of a big bang of energy, and a mixing of things, and all of this being part of a impersonal world of form, at which stage early on intelligence came in, and therefore when intelligence was formed in the mix of things, quite early on in the picture, everything that comes after is a result of intelligence. So we see this increasing complexity in life that isn't, well, that couldn't happen just random. I'm not saying random. That's all happened because of intelligence. Intelligence happened to get formed early on in the piece. And so all of this could be a result of biological intelligence. And then you say, well, I'm actually happy to run with that, not as an absolute idea of what life is, but it's definitely here in the blueprint. All of the causal explanation is here, all the way back to the Big Bang. It can be observed in physics. So I said, why don't I, at least on one level, run with it being a creation of an explosion, and what I call Source is before that. And we don't know what that is. So anyway, we really question a lot of our beliefs at some point. And your point is still completely valid, because in the end we say, well, I don't know which one it is, whether this is all a creation in the mind of a divine God, which from one perspective I go, actually that could be complete fantasy, very useful in order for us to awaken to the consciousness, but that consciousness might be just the consciousness of the body, and that's what we need in order to live happily. So the piece, whichever model you run with, the model becomes irrelevant. And that's why you go, who cares? I am. Who cares? I am. So.